It's a pleasure to be here again. I think to myself, what gives me the qualifications to even attempt to make a list of the 10 greatest books in Jewish history? And as I mentioned in the description of the lecture, I'm not talking about the 10 greatest, most favorite books of mine, nor am I talking about the books that have got the greatest critical acclaim over the centuries. Rather, I'm talking about 9 books, and then there'll be one extra one at the end, that I think have made the biggest impact on my Jewish life, on Jewish life perhaps in general. And I'd like to hear towards the end also if anybody disagrees with me, or if you think that I've left out something that you think is a glaring error. But I'm not going to be presenting these books in any chronological order, but I will start with the earliest book on my list, and that is the Mishnah. The Mishnah was compiled around 200 CE, and the Mishnah is one of the great transgressions of Jewish law. One of the great transgressions, the Mishnah itself. Why is the Mishnah a transgression? It's transgression because it records the oral tradition, and the rule is that you don't write down the oral tradition. The oral tradition is supposed to stay oral, and there's a lot of dangers in putting an oral tradition on paper. The obvious one being that a text that's on paper tends to be looked at in a rigid way, and the tradition mandated that oral traditions stay oral. Nonetheless, in 2000 CE, Yehuda Hanasi, Judah the Prince, who compiled and edited the Mishnah, made the decision with his colleagues that we better write this stuff down, because if we don't, we're going to lose it. It happened to be a lull in the violence against the Jewish people at the time, so they had some luxury to be able to write it down. There were other Mishnahs, by the way. The Talmud talks about the Mishnah of Rabbi Akiva and a few other. So these were compilations that the great sages put together, recording the oral tradition. Now, the Mishnah was the first text of the rabbinic tradition. There have been lots and lots of rabbinic texts over the centuries, but the Mishnah is the first one. And it was compiled after the destruction of the Second Temple. But the assumption of the Mishnah, interestingly enough, is that it's assumed that the temple was not destroyed. So it's recording all of the tradition regarding the temple as if it still stands. Now, one of the unique things about the Mishnah is that while it's a compilation of rabbinic disputes, and it does something extraordinary, which is that it preserves the minority opinions. One might think that a religious text would only record what the rabbis decided was the right answer, but no, the Mishnah records the minority opinions as well. Now, there are 6 sections to the Mishnah. You may be familiar, of course, with the song that we sing on Passover, who knows one, I know one. Well, who knows 6? I know 6. 6 are the orders of the Mishnah. In English, they're called seeds, which is agriculture. The second one is seasons. That's Shabbat and the festivals. Then women, husband and wife relationships. Damages, which is civil law and criminal law and the courts. And holy things, which includes temple laws and kosher laws and sacrifices. And finally, the 6th one is called purity, which is family purity and ritual purity. The section of the Mishnah that people are most familiar with, many people don't realize that it's actually a part of the Mishnah, is the ethics of the fathers, Pirkei Avot. Pirkei Avot is stuck there in the Mishnah, very different from the entire rest of the text, but there it is in the end of the section of the Mishnah called damages. We learn lots and lots of things from the Mishnah itself. The Tanaim, which means instructors, these were the rabbis of the Mishnah, and they recorded oral tradition. So, for example, the 4 questions that we recite on Pesach, you find those in the Mishnah. Now, one way that I like to explain the language of the Mishnah is by saying the following. The phone, the shower, okay. The phone, the shower, okay. Now, what does that mean, the phone, the shower, okay? It's shorthand for there's a phone call, I'm in the shower, okay, But the Mishnah, that's an English example, but the Mishnah does the same thing in Hebrew. It's written in a kind of code, a shorthand code, and you have to either know the code or read commentaries on the Mishnah in order to follow it through. Now, the Mishnah, the word Mishnah and the word neshama have the same letters, which is something nice to think about. And finally, one more thing about the Mishnah before I get to number 2 is that there is a strange Mishnah which says that good doctors go to hell. Not just doctors, but good doctors go to hell. And it's right there in the Mishnah, just the way I'm saying it. Good doctors go to hell. And the question, of course, is why do good doctors go to hell? What could that possibly mean? And there are a number of different interpretations of the statement, but the one that I like the best is the one that uses gematria, that uses the system whereby each Hebrew letter is also a number. So Aleph is 1, and Beit is 2, and Gimel is 3, and so forth. So the gematria for good, which is Tov in Hebrew, is the number 17. So one commentator says that you don't read good doctors go to hell, but read 17 doctors go to hell. Well, what's a 17 doctor? The 17 doctor is somebody who reads the Shemona Esrei, who reads the prayer that we say 3 times a day, 18 blessings. Now today there's 19 blessings because the one was added, but the traditional Shemona Esrei had 18 blessings. And one of the blessings was thanking God for healing. So the good doctor, the 17 doctor, is the doctor who thinks that he or she is the healer, doesn't think that God is the healing and that the doctor is just a conduit for the healing. So it's not a good doctor who goes to hell, but it's a doctor who reads the 18 blessings and leaves out the one about good health and the source of health. And that makes it 17 blessings, not 18 blessings, and that's the good doctor. So my first choice for my list is the Mishnah. Now, jumping to another century, many centuries later, another of my choices for the list is the book Eitz Chaim. Eitz Chaim are the teachings of the Ari. The acronym Ari stands for Adenu Rabbeinu Isaac. His name was Isaac, but the Ari, he is known today as the greatest Kabbalist who ever lived. Now, he wrote very few things, but the book by the Ari was really written and compiled by Rabbi Chaim Vital, who was a student of the Ari's, and he put the teachings down, and that came out in the year 1573. The Eitz Chaim is about the divine order and a perception of reality. What is reality? What's hiding behind what we think is reality? The very first line of Eitz Chaim begins, before the beginning of creation, there was only the highest and fullest light. And it goes on and on and on, talking about all of the insights that the Ari had regarding Kabbalistic Jewish tradition. It's remarkable to think that the Ari died when he was 38 years old. Sometimes we hear the teaching that you have to be 40 years old to study Kabbalah. Well, the greatest Kabbalist who ever lived, the Ari, never made it to 40. He only lived to the age of 38. He went to Sfat in Israel, and he spent 2 years there, and then he died. Again, as Rabbi Steinsaltz teaches, he was the greatest Kabbalist who ever lived. He lived in Sfat, which was the spiritual capital of the Jewish people. Other greats who lived there at the time was Joseph Caro, the author of the Code of Jewish Law, and Shlomo Alkabetz, who was the author, among other things, of L'chod Dodi, and Moshe Cordovero as well. The Ari talks in Eitz Chaim about Ma'aseh Merkava and Ma'aseh Bereshit, the study of the chariot as described in the book of Ezekiel, and the study of the creation story in Bereshit, in Genesis. And the Eitz Chaim contains thousands of discoveries that the Ari made about the Torah. One of the most well-known is the concept of tzimtzum, that God contracted himself in order to create the world. God is everywhere, and God contracted himself to make room for this finite creation, a universe of ours, and that's known as tzimtzum. Also, the Ari taught the notion of the breaking of the vessel. God poured, as the teaching goes, God poured his divine light into a vessel. The vessel was shattered because the vessel could not possibly contain all the divine light. So it's shattered, and the stuff of the world, all the objects and all the things in the world are the result of this breaking of the vessel. And the shards of this broken vessel contain divine light, and it's our job in the world to release the divine light from everything that we see in the world. One of the reasons we say blessings over food is to help to release the divine light that's contained within food, for example. The Eitz Chaim also teaches about the 10 Sfirot, which are the basic vocabulary of Kabbalah. If you don't know the 10 Sfirot, there's no real way of studying Kabbalah. And the teachings from the Ari contained in Eitz Chaim talk a lot about the 10 Sfirot and our understanding of it. The essence of the book, as one commentator says, is that life is the struggle to redeem light. Life is the struggle to redeem light. So my second book of my 10 books is Eitz Chaim. Now my third one is the Talmud. The Talmud is partly is the Mishnah, but it's also the Gemara, and the Gemara was written in Aramaic, whereas the Mishnah was written in Hebrew, and the two together, the Mishnah and the Gemara, constitute the Talmud. And this is my next greatest book in Jewish history. The Talmud, as Rabbi Steinsaltz teaches, is a collection of paradoxes. And Rabbi Steinsaltz also points out that the Talmud may be the only spiritual book in human history that objects to itself and that encourages people to object to it, to fight with it, to battle with it, to slam it, to challenge it. Rabbi Steinsaltz, who of course in his lifetime was the great Talmudist, points out that any Jewish community throughout Jewish history who did not have a Talmud, did not have the Talmud to study, did not survive. There are two Talmuds. There's the Babylonian Talmud and the Yerushalmi, the Jerusalem Talmud. They both have the same Mishnah, but they have different Gemaras. Talmud means learning, and the Gemara is the Aramaic word for finish, or to finish or complete. But let me just read to you a couple of interesting things about the Talmud. Number one, the Talmud is the oral law, and yet it's an indispensable part of the written law. The Talmud is the primary source of Jewish law, but the Talmud cannot be cited as an authority. You can't say the Talmud says, and therefore such and such, because while the Talmud is a primary source of Jewish law, you cannot cite the Talmud as a point of law. On the one hand, the Talmud is very carefully edited, extremely carefully edited. On the other hand, when you read the Talmud, it seems like a free association document. It goes from topic to topic very freely. The Talmud addresses the subjects of everyday life. There's almost nothing you can think of in 2022 that you can't find somewhere in the Talmud. But while the Talmud addresses everyday life, it also treats unrealistic subjects the same way. For example, in the section of the Talmud called Pesachim, all about Pesach, the rabbis talk about a mouse. This mouse goes into the wall with a piece of chametz. He comes out of the wall with a piece of chametz, and he goes into the wall with a piece of matzah. He then comes out of the wall with a piece of matzah and goes back into the wall with a piece of chametz. Well, ladies and gentlemen, there's never been in the history of mice, never been a mouse like this mouse. But the rabbis invented this mouse because they always ask the question, well, what if there was such a mouse? What if there was such a situation? Even though the Talmud addresses subjects of everyday life, it treats abstract and unrealistic subjects in exactly the same way. The Talmud is rigorously logical, almost mathematically logical, and yet it doesn't use mathematical or abstract symbols. It communicates its ideas through imagery, not through abstractions. Although the Talmud serves for practical purposes and it gives us an aid to our observance, the Talmud is an end in itself. Why do you study Talmud? Because you study Talmud. You're not studying Talmud to get smart, or you're not studying Talmud to be a big shot in the community, and you're not studying Talmud to find out the law. You're studying Talmud. Why? The sages say because we study Talmud. In the Talmud, one side is wrong, and yet both sides are right. And the sages violently disagree with each other, and yet the sages are very like-minded. Often people get a misimpression from the Talmud because you see the rabbis arguing over so many things. The fact of the matter is that those arguments are recorded in the Talmud. The things that the sages agreed upon don't appear by and large in the Talmud. So when you glance at the Talmud, you think, oh, well, this tradition of ours is a tradition of arguing. And while that's true, there is a lot of arguing in the Talmud. It's not because it represents that every one of these rabbis disagreed with each other on most things. Most of the rabbis agreed with each other on almost everything. But the few times when they disagreed, that's what gets into the Talmud. The Talmud was written centuries ago, and yet when we study Talmud, we speak in the present. We don't say Rabbi Akiva said, we say Rabbi Akiva says, because the Talmud is speaking in the eternal present. So it's always Rabbi Akiva says, Rava says, Yehuda Nazi says, that never in the past. And finally, I would say, just reiterate what I said before, which is that the Talmud is one of the sacred books of Jewish culture, and yet it encourages and demands that it be questioned. Again, is there another text in human history, in any religion, where the requirement of the major text is to disagree with it, is to fight with it, is to argue with it, is to question it? But so my third book of my 10 books that are the greatest in Jewish history is the Talmud. Now, from my point of view, another great book of the Talmud, of Jewish history, is the Zohar. The Zohar means splendor or radiance, and it was written in Aramaic. And what is the Zohar? It's a mystical commentary on the Torah. Now, there's a great controversy that's gone on for a long time as to who wrote the Zohar. So many scholars say that it was Moses de Leon in the 1200s who wrote the Zohar, whereas Jewish traditional view says that Shimon Bar Yochai in the 2nd century wrote the Zohar. Now, some people compromise and say, well, Shimon Bar Yochai taught a lot of this material, but it wasn't until Moses de Leon that he found scrolls and he added his own commentary, and that was the result of the Zohar. But the Zohar has become the central book of Kabbalah. There's no more important book than the Zohar. And when you study the Zohar, once again, you have to know those 10 sfirot. The 10 sfirot of the Ari is implanted within the Zohar and becomes the basic vocabulary of the Zohar. Without it, you're lost in the Zohar. But with it, you can just chip away at the text of the Zohar, and actually you can begin to understand what it's talking about regarding the nature of God, the nature of human souls, the origins of the universe, and many, many other esoteric and down-to-earth topics. Rabbi Steinsaltz was once invited to the New York Board of Rabbis for their annual meeting. Now, the New York Board of Rabbis is one of these miracle organizations. Every flavor of rabbi is there: Reform, conservative, Reconstructionist, Orthodox, everybody in between. The New York Board of Rabbis accepts all the rabbis from all the traditions. And once a year, they have an annual meeting, and the annual meeting has a keynote speaker. And the keynote speaker for one particular year was again Rabbi Steinsaltz. Rabbi Steinsaltz, the place was mobbed. The place was not even standing room only. The people were out the door trying to get an earful of Rabbi Steinsaltz's teachings. Rabbi Steinsaltz got up in front of the group and said, Kabbalah is the official theology of the Jewish people. He said, I want to repeat myself. Kabbalah is the official theology of the Jewish people. He then said to the rabbis, if you're not studying it, if you're not teaching it, one could fairly say you're not doing your job. Kabbalah is the official theology of the Jewish people. And you can walk in. I used to go to a lot of New Age bookstores, and the New Age bookstores talk about all kinds of lofty subjects. And there's rarely a section on Judaism in a New Age bookstore. There's a section on Buddhism and Hinduism and all kinds of traditions. But these books that you find in the New Age bookstores are all about abstract ideas of friendship and love and the nature of the soul and the nature of God. We don't find that in most Jewish books. Where do we find that, though? We find that in the Zohar. I want to read to you what might be one of the most famous, if not the most famous section from the Zohar itself. I'll just read a couple of words here. Rabbi Shimon says, woe to the man who says that the Torah came simply to relate stories and tales of mundane matters. If it was so, even at the present day, we could produce a Torah from simplistic matters and perhaps even nicer than those. If it came to illustrate worldly matters, even the rulers of the world have among them things that are superior. So let us follow them and produce from them a Torah in the same manner. However, all matters in the Torah are of a superior nature and are the uppermost secrets. Come and see. The world above and the world below are measured with one scale. The children of Israel below are opposite the lofty angels above. Who descends downward? The angels descend downward, investments, and they have no physical bodies of their own. If they have not acquired the dress of the world, they would not be able to exist in this world and would not be able to stand. And if this was so for the angels, how much more it is for the Torah that created these and all the worlds that exist due to her. Once it was brought down to this world, if it had not been donned in all these covering garments of the world would not have been able to tolerate it. Therefore, this story of the Torah is the mantle of the Torah. He who thinks that the mantle is actually essence of the Torah and nothing else is in there, let his spirit deflate and let him have no part in the world to come. Come and see, there's a garment that is visible to everyone. Simple people, when they see a person dressed beautifully, do not observe any further. They consider the garment as a body, and the body like the soul. Similar to this is the Torah. It has a body which is composed of the commandments of the Torah and are called the body of the Torah. This body is clothed with garments, which are stories in this world. The ignorant of the world look only at that dress, which is the story of the Torah, and are not aware of anything more. They do not look at what lies beneath that dress. So the Zohar is screaming at us, don't just take the text literally. The literal text is simply the garment for what lies underneath it. And what the Zohar helps us to do is to crack the text open and see the infinite, abstract, eternal ideas that are embedded in the text. It's the Chumash, the 5 books of Moses, that contains all the secrets. But it's the Zohar that teaches us how we can find those secrets embedded within the Torah. That's the Zohar. The next on my list of greatest books in Jewish history, the next one is the Shulkhana, the Code of Jewish Law. The Shulkhana itself means the set table, S-E-T, the set table. And what Joseph Caro tried to do in the Shulchan Aruch is to lay out all of the laws in Judaism. Joseph Caro did this in the year 1563. Now, at the same time, Moses Isserles was working on a similar project. But when he heard that Joseph Caro was writing this Shulchan Aruch, Moses Isserles abandoned the project and wrote a commentary on the Shulchan Aruch called the Mapah, which means the tablecloth. So we have the set table and we have the tablecloth. The set table by Joseph Caro, by and large, is talking about Sephardic observance, whereas Mapah, the tablecloth, is the commentary on the Shulchan Aruch and is talking about the Ashkenazic customs. Now, often people think that Joseph Caro, the author of the Code of Jewish Law, must have been a strict literalist. But the fact of the matter is that Joseph Caro was a mystic. He was a mystic who lived in Svat as well. And Joseph Caro, he wrote the Shulchan Aruch, but he also wrote other manuscripts which he claimed he never wrote, that they were written by automatic writing. In fact, if you go to the Jewish Theological Seminary today, you go to the rare book room, and they even have an actual manuscript that was by Joseph Caro that is said that he didn't write it himself, that it was this automatic writing. In fact, Alkabetz, the author of the Chlododi, wrote in another text that he saw Joseph Caro doing this automatic writing. So Joseph Caro was a man of law, but he was also a mystic. Now, there are 4 sections of the Shulchan Aruch. One is called Orach Chaim, which is about prayer in the synagogue and Shabbat and holidays. One is called Yerodea, which is about kashrut and mourning and conversion. And one is about, the next one is called Even HaEzer, which is about marriage and divorce. And finally, there's Choshen Mishpat, which is about finance and damages and the courts. Now, even though the Shulchan Aruch, the Code of Jewish Law, has the status today of the Code of Law, Joseph Caro never meant it for it to be that. It was a book that he was writing, he said, mainly for young students as a review, not to be the authoritative Code of Jewish Law. Rabbi Steinsaltz, and you'll find me quoting Rabbi Steinsaltz a lot. I wrote 2 books about him, and I think that he was the greatest of the great in my lifetime. Rabbi Steinsaltz once said, "There's a special place in hell for people who think to be Jewish is to follow the Shulchan Aruch. A special place in hell." Now, the rabbi wasn't criticizing the Shulchan Aruch as much as he was criticizing people who treat Judaism like a cookbook religion. You look in the book, you see what it says, and you do what it says. That's not the way Judaism is to be. Judaism is a tradition that asks all of us to be students and asks all of us to pursue the truth ourselves and with the guidance of others, not to just go to a book, see what the topic, you have a topic in your mind, you go to that particular topic, and that's what it says you do, and therefore you do it. Again, after all, the Code of Jewish Law was written in the 16th century. Why would we presume to think that the laws that he wrote down at that time in 1563 were still the laws today? There's lots of evolving of the law, and if anybody tells you otherwise, I'm ready to argue them. The Shulchan Aruch, by the way, was not Joseph Caro's most ambitious work. He wrote a huge work called the Beit Yosef, and the Shulchan Aruch was supposed to just be a simplified version of Beit Yosef. Joseph Caro never intended the Code of Jewish Law to become a primary source. And in fact, criticism has been lodged against the Shulchan Aruch for a long time because the fear that people would get lazy. And in fact, people do get lazy. They again think that you can look it up, find the answer, and that's it. My daughter was once teaching to a group of Jewish high school students at a secular high school. And one of the students came up to my daughter and said, "Oh, you Orthodox Jews, you have it so easy. All you have to do is look it up in the book, do what it says, and you're fine. And my daughter found herself explaining to this girl that, no, you have it wrong. What you do is you study and you study and you study and you study, and then you shut the book and you go outside and you have to, you're on your own. You have to decide what it is you're going to do based on your learning and also based on the situation that you're in. The Shulchan Aruch could not have possibly anticipated every possible variable in life. So the Shulchan Aruch has been an extraordinarily important book throughout Jewish history until today, and it's on my list of greatest books. There's a wonderful story. I've seen several versions of it about the Shulchan Aruch. The story goes that in this yeshiva, there were a bunch of young men who were studying to become rabbis, and as the months and years rolled on, the head of the yeshiva would ordain each of these young men. Now, there was one young man in the school who everybody knew was the most brilliant student of all, and yet the head rabbi never ordained him. He ordained other people who came and went, but this most brilliant student he never ordained. Well, it got to the point where the guy quit the yeshiva. And after he quit the yeshiva, the students went over to the head of the yeshiva and said, this guy who just quit, he was the most brilliant of all of us. How come you never gave him ordination, never gave him smicha? And the head of the yeshiva said, well, I didn't give him smicha because he was never able to master the 5th book of the Shulchan Aruch. Well, the students were surprised and said to the head of the yeshiva, the 5th book, there are only 4 books in the Shulchan Aruch. What do you mean he didn't master the 5th book? And the head of the yeshiva said, no, there are 5 books to the Shulchan Aruch, not 4. 4 of them are written down. The 5th one teaches you the common sense that you need to go to those 4 books and to be able to make some use out of it. What that young man didn't have, he didn't have a mastery of the 5th book of the Shulchan Aruch, which is how to apply the teachings of the Shulchan Aruch to real life. So that becomes my next in my series of books of the greatest in Jewish history. Now, my next book is the Siddur, the prayer book. The prayer book is the most popular Jewish book. When households have no other book, what they usually have is some kind of a prayer book. The word Siddur comes from the same root as the word Seder, as in Passover Seder, which means the order or arrangement. So that's what a Siddur is. And a long time ago, you would find a Siddur to only have basically 2 things in it. It would have the Shemona Esrei and it would have the Shema. But over the years, more and more things became added to it. Nothing's ever taken away from the Siddur. It's just an anthology that grows and grows and grows and grows. The earliest Siddur was written in the year 1850 by someone who's known as Amram, the Gaon, who was the head of the school of Surah in Babylonia. It wasn't set into type; it was before type, but it was handwritten. But it's considered to be the earliest Siddur that ever existed. There have been various other Siddurim over the centuries. The Saadia Gaon had a Siddur that he designed, and Yaakov Emden had a Siddur that he designed. The Vilna Gaon also had a Siddur that he designed, and Shneur Zalman, who's the founder of Lubavitch Chabad Hasidism, he compiled the Siddur that he said he used 60 different Siddurs as sources for him to compile his particular Siddur. Now, there are extra material in the Siddurim, not only the Shemona Esrei and the Shema. You'll find the Kiddush, you'll find Grace After Meals, Birkat HaMazon, you'll find the Zemiros, you'll find blessings, brachos, you find the text to Pirkei Avos in most Siddurs today. You find marriage ceremony, the blessing for the new moon, other halachas. You find the ritual of circumcision and the burial service for funerals, all in the in today's siddur. Now, one of the things that distinguishes Siddurim is that some of them are considered to be Zionist in their liturgy. They include a prayer for the state of Israel, and they consider Yom HaAtzmaut a Yontif. So there's also that difference. But something I want to read to you that you'll find as the first prayer, the first meditation in every siddur that's called Nusach Sfard. All the Hasidim use Nusach Sfard. Sephardim also may, by and large, use Nusach Sfard. Imagine that this is the very first meditation, page 1. If you go to an Art Scroll siddur today, and you go and you buy an Art Scroll siddur, and it's again Nusach Sfard, you will find this to be the very first prayer in the entire book. The prayer says, Elijah began and said, Master of the worlds, you are one, but not in counting. You are exalted beyond all exalted, more hidden than all hidden. No thought grasps you at all. You are he who brought forth 10 rectifications, which we call the 10 Sfirot, with which to guide concealed worlds that are not revealed and revealed worlds. In them you concealed yourself from human beings. You are he who ties them and unites them, because you are within them. Whoever separates one of these 10 Sfirot from the others is considered to have caused a separation within you. And the meditation goes on talking about the 10 Sfirot. Now imagine, so many Jews in the world never heard of the 10 Sfirot, and yet I've already said that it's the key to understanding the Zohar, it's the key to understanding the Ari and the Eitz Chaim, and it's also the very first prayer in the siddur is a meditation on the 10 Sfirot of Kabbalah. So it's extraordinary to see that this meditation begins the prayer book that Hasidim use today, and that many congregations use today as well. So the siddur becomes another on my list of greatest books. Another of the greatest books in Jewish history that, in my opinion, is the Book of Psalms. The Book of Psalms, of all of the books of Tanakh, is the one that is clearly the most popular one. It was written mostly by King David, although not exclusively by King David. The Psalms there were 10 Psalms written by Moses. There's a Psalm that was written by Jeremiah. There's a Psalm that was written by Haggai. There's a Psalm that was written by Zechariah. There was even a Psalm that was written by the sons of Korach. And the book of Psalms is often described as 5 P's, the letter P is in praise. That the Psalms are praise, prophecy, pain, petition, and poetry. The Psalms are pain, prophecy, praise, petition, and poetry. This is a description of what is contained in the Psalms. Almost every human, if not every human urge and emotion, is written in the Psalms and becomes a very, very personal book for so many of us. The oldest Psalm of the 150 Psalms is Psalm 90, which was written by Moses. The Book of Psalms is the third longest book in the Bible. The longest book in the Bible is Jeremiah. The second longest book in the Bible is the book of Genesis. And the third longest book in the Bible after Jeremiah and Genesis is the book of Psalms. Now, many famous lines that we've heard come from the book of Psalms. For example, the phrase "out of the mouth of babes," or the phrase "by the waters of Babylon." These are phrases that come from the book of Psalms. Of course, the most common psalm of all is Psalm 23. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He maketh me to lie down in green pastures. He leadeth me beside the still waters. He restoreth my soul, and so on. That's the 23rd Psalm, of course. Hallel, the service of Hallel, consists of Psalms 113 to 118. Kabbalah Shabbat has 7 psalms in it. Birkat Hamazon has the Psalm 126 for Shabbos and 137 for all the other days. But I want to tell you something very interesting about the book of Psalms. It's all about Psalm 46. There's been speculation for a long time that Shakespeare was involved in the translating of the Bible into English. And while it's not documented too clearly, there's some scholars who claim that Shakespeare had his finger in the book of Psalms. If you go to Psalm 46, which by the way was Shakespeare's age when the book of Psalms appeared, if you go to Psalm 46 in the book of Psalms and you count from the beginning 46 letters, you'll come to the word shake. And if you count 46 from the last word in the book of Psalms, you'll find the word spear. So embedded within Psalm 46 in the King James Version of Psalms is the word Shakespeare in Psalm 46. Is it a coincidence? Was it actually done that way? Nobody knows. But next time you have an opportunity to look at the book of Psalms in the King James Version, go to Psalm 46, count 46 words from the beginning and from the end, and you will see that the beginning says shake and the ending says spear. The book of Psalms is my next is the 7th of my list of greatest books of Jewish history. My next candidate for the 10 greatest books of Jewish history is the Midrash Rabbah. The Midrash Rabbah is the great collection of Midrashim. There are Midrash, smaller compilations of Midrashim, but Midrash Rabbah has the Midrash for each of the 5 books of Moses and for each of the 5 Megillot, Ruth and Song of Songs and Lamentations and Ecclesiastes and the book of Esther. All 5 of those 5 books have Midrash connected to it, and they are included again in Midrash Rabbah. Midrash Rabbah is the largest collection of Haggadah. We have Halakha, which is the laws, and we have Haggadah, which is everything other than the laws. And the Midrash Rabbah is the largest collection of Haggadah that we have. It was compiled over 8 centuries. So nobody sat down, no individual sat down and put it together. But it was compiled over 8 different centuries, and it was finally printed in the year 1545. It was never composed as one work. It's a collection of stories and homilies and parables and legal exegesis, all based on the biblical text. The oldest was Bereshit Rabbah and Leviticus Rabbah. The Midrash is written in Hebrew and Aramaic, and the book of Devarim Rabbah consists of 27 homilies. Shemot Rabbah is actually two works put together between the 9th and 11th centuries, and Bamidbar Rabbah is based on the first 7 chapters of the book of Numbers, and it was compiled somewhere between the 4th and the 12th centuries. Now, the Midrash means to search or to investigate. And if you've ever seen the animation, The Prince of Egypt, you will note that much of that animation comes from stories you find in the book of Midrash Rabbah. Now, I just want to read to you a excerpt from Midrash Rabbah. And God saw all that he had made and found it very good. And there was evening and there was morning the 6th day. So that's a verse from the book of Genesis, from the book of Bereshit. But the Midrash then adds, Rabbi Nachman said in Rabbi Samuel's name, behold, it was good refers to the inclination to good. And behold, it was very good refers to the inclination to evil. Can then the inclination to evil be called very good? That would be extraordinary. But without the inclination to evil, no man would build a house, take a wife, or beget children. So it gives us a little bit of a different different perspective on just what it's very good means in the book of Genesis. My favorite Midrash, I think, of all the thousands of Midrashim in the Midrash Rabbah, is the story of Abraham. Of course, Abraham was the great inviter of guests. He liked offering hospitality. His tent was open on all four sides. So not only could he greet guests, but if he saw guests in the distance, he could run to them and encourage them to come to his home, to his tent, to be a guest in his home. The Midrash says that when he had guests to his house, if people said grace, if people thanked God for their food, he would bid them a goodbye. But if one of the guests thanked Abraham and Sarah, but didn't thank God, Abraham, and they refused to thank God, then Abraham would charge them money for the food that they ate. Because if you think that I'm the source of the food, then pay me. If you think that God is the source of the food, then just pay God by giving gratitude and thanks to God himself. That's Midrash Rabbah, the 8th of my 10 books on the list. Finally, the last one is the Mishnah Torah by the Rambam. The Mishnah Torah, not the Mishnah, not the Torah, but the Mishnah Torah. The Mishnah Torah was written by Moses ben Maimon, the Rambam. He wrote it in Cairo, Egypt, between the years 1170 and 1180, and he wrote it in Hebrew. It was also called Yad HaZakah, which means the mighty hand. Sometimes it's called the Yad, which means hand, because Yad, the gematria for Yad is 14, and there are 14 books of the Mishnah Torah. Now, Maimonides, the author of the Mishnah Torah, says that that once you have the Mishnah Torah, as long as you have the Torah and his Mishnah Torah, you're never going to need any other book ever. Everything is in the Mishnah Torah, he said, and you won't need any other book. Rabbi Steinsaltz once said that the infuriating thing about what he said was not that he said it, but that it was true. And you'll find everything in Mishnah Torah. You even again find Kabbalah in the Mishnah Torah. People think that Maimonides was a rationalist, but he was not a rationalist. He included Kabbalah in his Mishnah Torah. Now the book was burned because the great criticism of his book was that he didn't give sources. He gave no sources at all. He just wrote down the law as it is, and it became, again, like the Shulkhana, it became an authoritative book of law. And the 14 books of the Mishnah Torah begin and end with the same topic. The beginning of the Mishnah Torah, it speaks about that the foundation of all foundations and the pillar of all wisdom is to know that there is a primary cause who brought existence into being. So the very, very opening sentence of the 14 books of the Mishnah Torah are about God. Way at the end, the very end of the 14th book, Maimonides comes back to the place where he began, where he says, knowledge of God will cover the world like water covers the sea. So that's my ninth on my list. So I took the liberty of adding a 10th to my list, a book that I feel will live for centuries, an extraordinary book. It's my favorite book in the whole universe, and it's this book, The 13-Petaled Rose by Rabbi Steinsaltz. Now, once I was on the subway reading this book, and I was in the subway in New York City reading this book, and there was a man sitting next to me. He was a chassid, dressed traditionally like a chassid. I would say he was about 85, 90 years old. He was reading the New York Post, and I was studying The 13-Petaled Rose by Rabbi Steinsaltz. At a certain point, I said to the man, excuse me, could you answer a question? And the man put down his New York Post, and he looked at me and he said, yes, how can I help you? So I showed him this book, the 13-Petaled Rose by Rabbi Steinsaltz, and I said, I'd like to read a passage to you. And this is the passage I read. Rabbi Steinsaltz writes, it has been said that each of the letters of the Torah has some corresponding soul. That is to say, every soul is a letter in the entire Torah and has its own part to play. The soul that has fulfilled its task, the soul that has done what it has to do in terms of creating or repairing its own part of the world and realizing its own essence, that soul can wait after death for the perfection of the world as a whole. But not all souls are so privileged. Many souls stray for one reason or another. Sometimes a person does not do all the proper things, and sometimes he misuses forces and spoils his portion and the portion of others. In such cases, the soul does not complete its task and may even itself be damaged by contact with the world. It has not managed to complete that portion of reality which only this particular soul can complete, and therefore, after the death of the body, the soul returns and is reincarnated in the body of another person, and again must try and complete what it failed to correct or what it injured in the past. I said to this chassid on the subway, "Do we believe this?" He said, "Of course." I said, "Jews believe in reincarnation?" "Excuse me, I never heard of it." He said to me, "Well, where did you get your Jewish education?" And I told him that I grew up without getting a Jewish education. It wasn't until I left my parents' home and started to struggle a little bit, I began reading books about Judaism. And I told him I had lots and lots of troubles integrating Judaism into my life. And at a certain point, this chassid looks at me and said, "You're luckier than I am." And I said, "How could I be luckier than you are? I just told you I didn't get a Jewish education as a kid. I just told you that I'm struggling with Judaism. How am I luckier than you are?" And the chassid said to me, "Every Jew is connected to God by a rope. Sometimes the rope breaks, as in your case, meaning my case. But what you do is you take the two ends of the rope and you tie it back together. And after you tie it back together, not only is it shorter than it was, but it's also stronger than it was." The chassid said to me on the subway that day, "You're closer to God than I'll ever get." And I think that chassid gave me the metaphor for my life. That what I've been trying to do is find the two ends of the rope and tie them back together and connect myself to Jewish tradition. So the 13 Petal Rose became my 10th of my list of books. And that's my proposal for what the 10 greatest books are. I wonder if anybody has any comments or any objections or any additions.
Of course, they have comments and objections and additions because this is CSP and we only have a few minutes though. So let me share a few things. First of all, thank you for sharing your list. And, this is Arthur Kurzweil's list. It's not CSP's official list. And, you have to say, you said at the beginning. So everyone in the audience, you may have a similar list, a different list, an overlapping list. But we appreciate you sharing your list and sharing why these books are important to you. So let me ask a few questions. First of all, to state that CSP actually hosted Adin Steinsaltz, Rabbi Steinsaltz, many years ago. We're very fortunate to have him in our community. And I just wanted people to know quickly why he is so important to you. Can you share just a quick story as to your connection to Rabbi Steinsaltz?
Well, Rabbi Steinsaltz is important to me because I heard about him. I went to him. I managed to get a private appointment with him. I sat down before I went to him and wrote down the biggest questions in my life. And I went to him with those. It was 11 different questions. And when I met him that day, he gave me 3 hours of his time, and he answered all 11 questions like nobody else ever answered my questions. And I thought to myself, this is a guy who I can rely on. He's not just one more person with one more opinion. He's the greatest Talmudist of our time. He's a Kabbalist, and he spoke to my questions like he knew just what I was thinking of. I just developed tremendous confidence in him, and he was a brilliant, extraordinary individual, and I had the great privilege of being his chauffeur. When he came to New York, I was his driver. For 25 years, I was the one who picked him up at the airport at JFK at 5 o'clock in the morning, every Sunday morning when he came, and I spent all that time with him, and he became my Rebbe.
Thank you. I think we'll do a program about what you learned based on your book that you wrote about that experience of being Rabbi Steinsaltz's chauffeur. So a few questions. Is there an import to the order of the books that you've given to us?
No, I decided not to do them chronologically and not to do them in any particular order. I just shuffled the deck, and I did it as a result of that shuffle.
One book that people asked that you left out was the book of Job. That one person felt that should be on your list. Do you have a short list of books that you did not include, like the book of Job?
Well, the Book of Job was one of the books that was on my short list. Another one was Sefer Yetzirah, which is the first Kabbalistic text that we know of. So those two books were two that I wanted to squeeze in there, but didn't. I would say those two would be my additions.
You know, in the sports world, they often argue who are the best basketball players of all time. And people get into heated arguments, the top 10. And it does change throughout history, depending on, you know, if someone grew up in the 80s or the 70s or contemporary. So I would assume same here. Wendy says, what about the Haggadah? The Pesach Haggadah.
Well, yeah, absolutely right. The Haggadah is, in fact, now that you mention it, I should have replaced one of my 9 with the Haggadah. I think that you're absolutely right.
Okay, that was from Wendy. So
I stand corrected.
Wendy gets that point there. Let's see. You said that the Talmud preserves all the disagreements between the rabbis, but they mostly agreed. So where do we find their agreements?
Well, yeah, for example, in the Mishnah Torah or in the Shulkhana, these two codes of Jewish law, there's very little dispute among the rabbis as to what the laws are. The vast majority of them are agreed to by the sages of all times. But when they do have a disagreement, that disagreement is usually recorded somewhere in the Gemara, somewhere in the Talmud.
You noted that no one cites the Talmud for a halacha, for a law, and someone noted in the question, well, but isn't that where it comes from? So I guess how would you say when people cite the law, they're citing a rabbi who's then getting their source from the Torah and from the Talmud? Like how do people cite their law then if it doesn't come from?
When somebody is citing a point of law, they would go to the codes of law, to the Shulchan Aruch or the Mishnah Torah. The Talmud is sources that are used to get the law, but they're not the law itself. You don't find the law itself in the discussions among the Talmud within the Talmud.
Stuart says, when you talk about the Talmud, you didn't mention the important people on the page of the Talmud, Rashi and Tosfot and so on. So he wanted to make sure that that was brought up, that the Talmud also has a page of Talmud has got more than just the rabbis arguing with each other. It's got the layers of history of later historic rabbis translating and trying to help us understand.
In fact, when Rabbi Steinsaltz published his English translation of the Talmud, he included Rashi in Rashi's script, in the typeface. And when asked why, he said, you can't conceive of the Talmud without Rashi.
People talked about the prophets. They weren't on your list. Aren't they important? Let's see what else we have here. Someone is confused as to her book of the Torah, which is 5 books. It doesn't include the Psalms. Well, you can have the 5 books of Moses, or you can have the whole Tanakh. The whole Tanakh will include the Torah, the Nevi'im, the Ketuvim, the prophets, and the writings. And then you'll get all of these books. So it just depends on what you bought in the store, I guess, would be an answer to that question. Let's see what else we have here. Yeah, I wanted to make sure people know that we've done 7 programs with Danny Matt. 6 of them were focused on his translation of the Zohar. We just did a series with teachers from Hadar, in which one of the series was understanding the prayer book. So much of what you've given us today ties into what we do at CSP. We bring people like Rabbi Steinsaltz. We focus on these books, and we haven't done anything on the 13 petaled rose. So that's why we're going to have you back to focus on Rabbi Steinsaltz and his teaching. Let's see. Anybody else have any last questions? We're a little bit over time, and I want to make sure to respect our speaker. Please, the name of the last book. The last book is The 13 Petaled Rose by Adin Steinsaltz. And I will, in the follow-up email, I'll include the list and some, references to what we talked about today. The Maimonides Guide to the Perplexed is not on your list. You chose the Mishnah Torah, but not the Guide to the Perplexed. Any particular reason?
Well, the Mishnah Torah is a code of Jewish law that's cited all the time. The other book by the Rambam and other works as well are not nearly as well known or as influential as the Mishnah Torah. So Guide for the Perplexed is not read or cited by people very much in comparison to the Rambam's Mishnah Torah.
I will add that my wife is studying to be, well, she's a cantor, and she has a website, and she needed a name for it. And, what name would best encapsulate teaching about prayer? So I came up, a Guide for the Perplexed.
Very good.
I own that. No one can steal that, please. It's my trademark.
Okay.
Okay, I think that's about what we have time for. Thank you for sharing the list of your top 10. If there's a book that you guys, someone of you would like to include in the list that wasn't there, you can email me, and if you email me fast before I send out the follow-up, I'll say this book, is a suggestion by Christine, or this book, Herb said this book has to be on the list, and I'm happy to share that as well. I wanted to thank you all for being with us. I want to thank Arthur Kurzweil for spending more time with CSP. Hopefully you'll come back. And I want to wish you Mazel Tov on your new house in Scotch Plains, New Jersey. You're all invited over when things are safe for a big party in the backyard at the Kurzweils. He's going to invite his whole family from the genealogy side to be there as well, and some schnapps for everybody. So thank you. Anyway, it's good to see you all. Welcome back to our normal programs for CSP. It's nice having such an erudite CSP community with us now, and that has been with us now for many years. And maybe if this is your first time, thank you for joining us. Hope you'll come back. Take care. Be safe.